There's also an academic twist to all of this. In fact, it's a major theme in the academic social sciences, going back at least 50 years or more. One of the most prominent modern American political scientists, Harold Lasswell, who's a leading figure in communications and such things, he wrote the article on propaganda in the International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, which was published in 1933. And in it he says that we should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. The best judges are the elites, us smart guys, the cool observers, and we must therefore be ensured the means to impose our will for the common good, of course. This, he said, will require a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda, because of the ignorance and superstition of the masses. Same theme all the way through. The basic problem is this. The idea is that if you have a society in which the voice of the people is heard, you got to make sure that that voice says the right thing. In totalitarian societies, it's not a big problem. You got a club in your hand, and if people don't behave the right way, you hit them with a club or threaten them with it. So it doesn't really matter much what they think. What matters is what they do, and that you control by force. But as the capacity of the state to control by force erodes, it's necessary to control what people think. And in fact, I think you find much more sophisticated concern for thought control precisely as the society becomes more free. I don't think it's surprising that the sophisticated discussion, things like the public relations industry and the academic side of it, and the journalistic side and all these kinds of things I've been sampling, I suspect if one did a comparative study, you'd find that they develop primarily in relatively free societies. Ours is a very free society in the sense that the state has, by comparative standards, very limited resources to control by force. And I think it's undoubtedly, in fact, the most sophisticated in the terms of, in the reliance on techniques of indoctrination and control. Public relations industry in particular is an American creation. You'll notice, of course, the close similarity to Leninist ideology, to Bolshevism, which also assumes that the radical intellectuals are the specialized class, the vanguard, and they've got to lead the stupid and ignorant masses to a better society. In fact, the two conceptions are very much alike. I think that's probably one of the reasons why there's been historically such an easy transition from one to another. The move from being a Leninist enthusiast to a passionate supporter of state capitalism and working for American aims, that takes place overnight. It's been going on for years. It's called the God that failed transition. And it happens very simply. I mean, in the early stages, it had some authenticity to it when people like Ignazio Silone and others were making this transition. But in recent years, it's become just a farce. I mean, technique of opportunism. And the transition is very easy, I think, because there isn't much of a difference in ideological change. It's just a matter of where you think power lies. If you think there's going to be a popular revolution, and you can ride that revolution to state power and then wield the whip over the masses, you're a Leninist enthusiast. If you see that that's not going to happen, and power lies in the state capitalist institutions which you have to serve as a manager, an ideological manager, you do that. But it's basically a very similar position. And in fact, in the last century or so, since there's been a more or less identifiable secular intelligentsia, I think you find typically that they fall into one or the other of these two categories. They associate themselves with one or the other system of power and hierarchy and subordination. In fact, what I just said is almost a tautology. It's only if you submit to those systems that you're counted as a respectable intellectual, for obvious reasons. Well, coming up to more modern times, in the post-Second World War period, you find, again, a deep concern over the need to control and deceive the public, to control the public mind. Presidential historian Thomas Bailey wrote in 1948, at the time when we were sort of setting off on a new war, the Cold War, he wrote, "Because the masses are notoriously short-sighted and generally cannot see danger until it's at their throats, our statesmen are forced to deceive them into an awareness of their own long-run interests. Deception of the people may in fact become increasingly necessary unless we're willing to give our leaders in Washington a freer hand. And in 1981, as the United States was launching a new crusade for freedom, Samuel Huntington, the professor of government at Harvard, said in a private but published discussion, interchange, "You may have to sell intervention or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you're fighting." That's what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine, which is quite accurate and gives a certain insight into the nature of the Cold War, in particular into the nature of the war against Nicaragua, which is what he specifically had in mind. Well, these concerns over controlling the public mind tend to rise to the surface, particularly after periods of wars and turmoil, like the 17th century revolution, the Civil War, or like the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson launched the major Red Scare, which is the major example in modern American history, of all of American history, of state repression. That was really large-scale and effective in destroying unions and destroying independent politics and eliminating independent thought and so on. And the same thing happened after World War II with the phenomenon that's mislabeled McCarthyism. It's mislabeled because it was actually initiated by the liberal Democrats in the late 1940s. McCarthy just came along at the tail end of it and vulgarized it a little. The reason for this is that periods of wars and turmoil have a tendency to arouse people from apathy and to make them think and to make them organize often. So that's why you get things like the Red Scare and McCarthyism right after periods of war and turmoil, and the same thing happened after the Vietnam War, which had the same effect. After the Vietnam War, elites were concerned about what they called a crisis of democracy. In fact, one of the most interesting books on this topic, or one of the most interesting books on, most of the insightful books, I think, on the modern democratic system, is called The Crisis of Democracy. It's a study, the only book-length study published by the Trilateral Commission. It's an important group put together by David Rockefeller in 1973, and it represents the more or less liberal internationalists from the three major centers of modern capitalism: the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, hence trilateral. And remember, this is the liberals. This is the group out of which Jimmy Carter and most of his administration came. What's the crisis of democracy that they're concerned with in all of the democratic societies? Well, the crisis is that during the 1960s, large groups of people who are normally passive and apathetic began to try to enter the political arena to press their demands. And that's a crisis which has to be overcome. The naive might call that democracy, but that's because they don't understand. The sophisticated understand that that's a crisis of democracy. The American spokesman, again Samuel Huntington, wrote in his report that Harry Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers. In those days, there was no crisis of democracy. Things were working just right. But in the 1960s, you got all this turmoil. I mean, young people and women and, you know, labor. I mean, all kinds of weird people who were supposed to be sitting quietly in the corners began to get involved and caused this crisis. I mean, the same crisis that arose in the 17th century and that repeatedly arises when people begin to try to take advantage of the formal opportunities that exist. Among the terrible things that were happening during the 60s causing this crisis, they said, was that you had this group of people who they called value-oriented intellectuals, people who were concerned with things like truth and justice and all that sort of nonsense, and they're opposed to the good guys, the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals. They called them the commissars, the ones who just do the job, you know. But you had these value-oriented intellectuals, and they were doing all sorts of horrible things like delegitimizing the institutions that are responsible for the indoctrination of the young, like schools and universities. Remember, this is an internal discussion, so they kind of let their hair down. Their general proposal at the end of all of these lengthy and thoughtful discussions was that what we need is more moderation in democracy to mitigate the excess of democracy and to overcome the crisis. In plain terms, what that means is that the public has to be reduced to their proper state of apathy and obedience and driven from the public arena if democracy is to survive in the appropriate sense, with the specialized class, you know, the cool observers, smart guys, the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, doing our job in the interests of the people who have real power. That's the liberal side. I won't go into what the reactionary side says about the matter.